It's October, and that means Steam Next Fest is here, along with its usual cavalcade of demos to play. Next Fest is always an exciting time because there are so many smaller games that are off my radar that I get to try out, and Next Fest has a very high success rate for indie bangers. While I'm still a fairly new channel and mainly focus on larger titles, I still feel it's important to give smaller, lesser known titles a chance to shine. And your boy TT here had the opportunity to have early hands-on with a demo dropping today during the Next Fest, and that is AI Limit. In case you had not heard about AI Limit like I had before, let me break it down for you. AI Limit is a new game from Chinese studio Sense Games, which is a part of the PlayStation China Hero Project, a project set up by PlayStation to support budding Chinese indie devs to create great games by assisting them with development, publishing, and marketing resources. The game is an action Souls-like that sees you take up the role of a cute anime robot girl called Arissa as she wakes with amnesia in the sewers of a post-apocalyptic world. And there is nothing more anime than a cute girl with amnesia swinging around a huge sword. Arissa is what's known as a blader, an autonomous robot that's tasked with a unique mission. And Arissa comes to find out that her unique mission is to restore the post-apocalyptic world by reviving these things called branches. Branches in the world of AI Limit take the place of bonfires from other Soulslikes. So the game, right from the get-go, establishes your goals and gets you going with just enough context to get you on your way. Everything you know from a regular Souls-like is here, so it's going to feel very familiar in many respects. But this is one Souls-like that is doing work to make the baseline gameplay more forgiving for those players who maybe are turned off by some of the more punishing aspects of traditional Souls games. But it also does a lot of really interesting things that caught my attention, and I want to dig more into that. But before I do, it would mean the world to me if you would like and subscribe below if you want to see more early impression videos like this in the future. It also helps to let more and more people know about AI Limit during the Steam Next Fest. Now let's see what makes AI Limit so special. Like I mentioned earlier, the game is a Souls-like, which are a dime a dozen these days. Feels like every few months we get a new one hitting the shelves in one way or another. But AI Limit does its best to stand out with its unique take on combat. Every Souls has a unique twist on the combat system, and AI Limit is no exception. And it all starts with stamina. With Souls games, stamina is such a vital part of the gameplay experience as it determines how often you swing, your spellcasting ability, blocking power, running, you name it, it's probably affected by stamina on some level. It's a way of balancing out a character to ensure that they're never too strong and can continue wailing on something until it falls over, or even blocking all incoming attacks. But AI Limit makes the bold choice to omit stamina altogether, and for good reason. Instead of stamina, the game uses a unique system called sync rate. Sync rate is a sort of stamina/mana hybrid system that starts at 100%, but decreases if you use any sort of ability that you have equipped. So if you use a special attack with your melee weapon or a spell, that gauge decreases. Seems simple enough. Now, here's the tricky part. Your sync rate also determines how much damage you deal in combat. If you reach above a certain threshold for sync rate, your attacks will deal bonus damage, as will your abilities. So your goal as a player should be to stay in the sync rate sweet spot as much as you can so you perform efficiently in combat. And the only way to build your sync rate back up after you spend it is to attack enemies via your melee weapon of choice. There are plenty of melee weapons on offer, which all bring something unique and different to the combat sandbox in terms of attack power and speed. I opted to go with the gigantic broadsword that takes a long time to swing but can chunk enemies pretty nasty like. And with a single press of the triangle button, you can swap to a second melee weapon immediately, even in the middle of a combo. And since there's no weight limit in the game, you are encouraged to use whatever weapons strike your fancy as long as you hit the stat requirements. So I chose both the broadsword and a cleaver type weapon that didn't hit quite as hard but let me attack more frequently as a result. The combat feels very weighty and satisfying in ways a good Souls-like should, with weapon swings taking the perfect amount of wind up and enemies stagger when taking sustained damage like they should, allowing you to keep the pressure on. The game also gives you a choice between different defensive measures, which I found immensely helpful during my time in the demo. It gives you access to either a parry a la the well-timed pistol shot in Bloodborne, or a shield that can absorb hits and shoot a blast after being charged up, but both come with their own trade-offs. The parry requires you to be near perfect with your frame inputs, and if you mistime it, you're going to be down gain 10 sync rate points as well as some health. And as for the shield, while it can absorb hits, once you're below a certain sync rate, attacks will start to damage you, so it's recommended that you only use it when you're above a certain sync rate threshold, which is difficult when using the shield because as you hold it up, it slowly drains your sync rate. My parry timing is atrocious in most cases, so I found myself going to the shield pretty consistently in order to not die as often. And I appreciate that the game didn't force me into using just one of the two options, as you can hot swap to your choice of defensive tool whenever you want to fit the situation. If I was comfortable with weaker enemies' attack patterns, I felt confident in using the parry to dispatch them, while tougher enemies got the shield. There are also spells that you can pick up after defeating certain enemies that take up a part of your sync bar. The example in this demo is a laser that you get from the first mini-boss, which is an effective long-range damage tool that you can use to deal a certain chunk of damage. But it uses up 25% sync rate, so it has to be used sparingly or else it eats into your damage potential up close. The sync rate system encourages you to play as aggressively as possible in order to efficiently use your abilities like blocking, parries, special attacks, and spells, but you also have to maintain a certain sync rate so that you can block without sustaining damage, for instance. The combat system functions very similar to how Bloodborne does, where you are practically required to play as aggressively as possible in order to maintain peak combat efficiency. You have to keep your sync rate up so you have access to your abilities, but it's also up to you to decide how you want to spend the meter you're given. It's almost like a fighting game in a way. You pick what your kit will be, now it's just up to you to use that meter in whatever ways work best for you and the situation you're in. Now, what interests me most about the sync rate system is what the game can do with it in the future. The default sync rate has the best damage locked behind 80 to 100% sync rate, but what if there were different items that made the best sync rate sit somewhere in the middle of the bar, requiring you to balance the use of your melee and abilities so as to sit perfectly in the small sweet zone in the middle. You won't be able to melee too much and you can't cast as often, but the trade-off is that the sweet spot in the center of the bar would deal much more damage. I love the concept of the system and I want to see it explored more in depth in the full release. Everything about the combat system is honestly very beginner friendly. It gives you a lot of tools from weapons to spells and even your choice of damage mitigation, but it still requires you to be adept at combat because you can't deal all of your damage via your abilities and expect to win. You still need some solid fundamentals to come out on top of any situation. And with a bit of game time, I think any beginner will have a decent time jumping into the game. Overall, the combat feels great and it's clear that the team took a lot of the right notes from the Souls series where it matters in terms of combat while also putting their own spin on it. The sync rate system is a massive hit for me as it simplifies the mana and stamina system in a way that makes it much more engaging because it's a system that requires you to be actively participating in it instead of just waiting for a bar to recharge. The way the game handles souls is also incredibly beginner friendly. When you die, you do not lose all of the souls like you would in a traditional Souls-like. The game uses a system called retention rate, which is tied to one of your equipped items called a nucleus. Each nucleus has its own retention rate, which determines how much of your souls you keep when you die. You start at a default retention rate of 70, which is incredibly forgiving. It's a nice middle ground for people maybe not as skilled at Soulslikes and helps cut down on the frustration of going to retrieve your souls only to die to a mishap like falling down a pit by mistake or getting stun locked by 4 dudes in a corner. You don't lose everything if you fail once. The retention system wants you to explore and experiment and not feel worried about turning the corner. Like I said, lots of systems in the game are very accommodating to new players. So if you have ever thought that a Souls game was a bit daunting, this could be a great jumping in point to the genre. What's not beginner friendly, however, are some of the enemies. Since the game is a Souls-like, of course the enemies are going to be a bit menacing. And when you're going for a combat system similar to Bloodborne, it's going to feel more difficult because it requires you to get up close and friendly with your enemies to get your sync rate back up after you spend it. But the big difference here is that when an enemy hits you in Bloodborne, you have the chance to fight back and restore some of that lost health. Not so in AI Limit. While I think the sync rate system is fantastic and allows for a lot of build diversity and different playstyles from game start, I think enemies hit maybe a little too hard and their animations leave a bit to be desired in terms of telegraphing when an attack is coming. Hitboxes are fair and it never felt like I took a hit I wasn't supposed to, but damage is super high, even here clear in the first level. You'll get chunked in 2 hits from most enemies, even the basic ones, which doesn't feel super fair when their attacks don't feel telegraphed as well as they would be in a FromSoft game. I know it's a small team, and animations aren't going to be nearly as polished as something like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, so I don't think it's a super fair comparison to make, but it's still something to consider as it makes boss fights harder to get a read on, especially the final boss in the demo. He kicked my ass big time, and I blame a lot of that on animation reading. But with enough time and patience, even the toughest enemy can be felled, but it's still something to be considered. Bosses are another massive part of Soulslikes and their appeal, and the game makes a fantastic first impression with the bosses on display. As you progress, you'll be taking on unique bosses as well as other bladers, and when they're defeated, they give you some pretty dope loot like new weapons or spells to use. The bosses were great fun in the demo, even if the final one kicked my ass over and over again. I know for many people, myself included, hate the run back to boss arenas after a failed boss attempt. It's literally the worst part of every Souls-like for me. Thankfully, at least in the demo, AI Limit is very gracious with bonfire placement and even puts them right before major boss arenas, allowing me to jump right in after every failed attempt. It cuts down on the tedium of failing a boss fight over and over again and makes the gameplay experience much more palatable, because even if I do lose over and over again, I'm still keeping a portion of my souls to make leveling up faster, which makes the sting of a loss much less apparent. Speaking of levels, the game uses a bit of a simplified version of the Dark Souls leveling system, which focuses on just 5 categories to put levels into. You have your life, your vitality, which determines sync rate gain and lowers cost, strength and technique, which determines what weapons you can wield, and lastly spirit, which affects the attack efficacy of your spells and abilities that eat at your sync rate. I am very appreciative that there are only 5 categories to put points into, because it means you are going to have less opportunities to royally screw up your build if you put points into the wrong category like you would in a traditional Souls-like. Keeping it confined to 5 stat dumps keeps things simple without feeling like anything substantial has been removed from the overall Souls experience. Moving away from gameplay for a moment, AI Limit clearly takes a lot of inspiration from other games that utilize post-apocalyptic landscapes like Fallout, Horizon Zero Dawn, or Nier Automata, especially Nier Automata, because come on, cute girl, big sword, ass, you get it. But with those games mentioned, the landscapes are often consumed by vegetation. That's not so with AI Limit, which puts the focus on restoring vegetation to the world and giving it a really unique flair that other games are missing. That lack of vegetation has knock-on effects on how the rest of the world building is established. Like, without plants, wildlife can't eat, and if there's no wildlife, what do the people eat? Well, that's easy. They eat mud, as there's just so much of it. It even serves as a secondary healing consumable for Orisa during combat, just downing slop like that. God, what a woman. The game does a great amount of world building with very little and expects you to piece things together with the context you've been provided, which is another Souls tradition kept firmly in place. And from what I've seen in the demo, the world has already got me asking so many questions and wanting more. After completing the demo, I really wanted to dig more into everything the game had to offer, even if the early encounters felt maybe a bit too punishing. I really like the sync rate system because even in the early game, I can tell it has an immense amount of potential with determining gameplay flow. And side note, I want to give a major round of applause to the localization team, as it's one of the few Chinese games I've played that's well localized. Many times we get games from China where the localization feels incredibly half-baked, with very strange sentence structure and word choices, but here everything makes sense and really helps to make the game much easier to enjoy for English-speaking audiences. It also helps that from what I've seen, everything involving actual NPCs has been voice acted, including our heroine Orisa, which is not something we see very often in Soulslikes other than the recent Star Wars Jedi games or The Surge. While Orisa doesn't say much, it helps the game stand out in a sea of other Soulslikes that hit the market. The voice acting is serviceable, which is fine, I think. It may come off as a bit unnerving for some players, but that's practically a Souls tradition at this point, along with characters spouting vague, nonsensical statements. I have very few complaints from my time with the demo. Despite being an indie title, the game felt very polished in most respects and can even hold its own when compared to the best playing games in the genre. There were some issues with dialogue mixing, a few subtitles didn't match their spoken dialogue, and enemy damage felt maybe a little too punishing, but other than that, I had a great time with it. And if you enjoy Soulslikes, I think you will too. AI Limit is a unique game with a lot of potential, and I think will stand out in the Souls-like genre genre for a long time thanks to its unique vibe and take on the aggressive combat system heavily inspired by Bloodborne. And let's be honest, it's probably the closest thing we're going to get to Bloodborne on PC for a long time. So that's AI Limit. You can play it right now for yourself on the Steam Next Fest, and after you're done with the demo, let me know what you think about it in the comment section down below. Did you like playing it? Do you think Arissa's cute? Please let me know. And special thanks goes to my channel members listed here. These people help to fund the channel and make it possible for me to continue doing what I love by making videos like these. An extra special thanks goes to the $3 members who are Cilantro and the Windigod. If you would like to become a channel member, you can do so by clicking the join button down below. I know I said I had one more video in me before Vessel of Hatred, but that will actually be coming next week, as it's going to be another big one that's taking extra time to write and record. You know, all that fun stuff. Please keep an eye on the subscription feed for when it does come out on Monday. And as always, this has been Testing Triangles. Thanks for watching.